Standards, no matter in what aspect of behavior, range in different cultures from the positive to the negative pole. In this episode of Philosophers Explained, we turn to Ruth Benedict's 1934 Patterns of Culture, in which the anthropologist takes up cannibalism, homicide, adultery, puberty rights, and so forth, wide-ranging across the world, to see what differing human cultures can teach us about alleged universal, objective, and absolute moral standards. Let's go to the text. Ruth Benedict was professor of anthropology at Columbia University in New York. In 1934, she published Patterns of Culture. And the two key concepts, of course, indicated in the title are culture. We're studying cultures, so that will need to be defined, but that cultures do exhibit patterns, and the purpose of anthropology as a social science is to discern what those patterns are. So let's plunge into the first chapter, titled The Science of Custom, and a definition of anthropology. Anthropology is the study of human beings as creatures of society. I will pause there. It's a strong phrase that we're not creatures from the anthropological perspective of our biology. We're not creatures of God. We're not even creatures of ourselves. Self-creation, we are creatures of society. And working out what that means is going to be a key thesis of the book. So that is to say, anthropology, fastens its attention upon those physical characteristics and industrial techniques, those conventions and values which distinguish one community from all others but belong to a different tradition. Jumping down to the next paragraph, an important statement about the value perspective, the kind of objectivity, we're going to put those in mild scare quotes, or outside perspective that the anthropologist needs to bring to his or her study. To the anthropologist, our customs and those of a New Guinea tribe are two possible social schemes for dealing with a common problem. And insofar as he remains an anthropologist, he is bound to avoid any weighting of one in favor of the other. So here, partly the general scientific and rational prescription that one's going to avoid one's personal biases, one's cultural biases, one's perhaps theoretical biases, and try to step outside, so to speak, one's own personal framework, wherever that comes from, and see one's own culture and other cultures from the outside, not to weight epistemologically, cognitively, or normatively one over the other. But this is a problem, and here we have then a claim about epistemological issues as they bear on the anthropologist's project. Quote, "No man ever looks at the world with pristine eyes. He sees it edited by a definite set of customs and institutions and ways of thinking. Even in his philosophical probings, he cannot go behind these stereotypes. His very concepts of the true and the false will still have reference to his particular traditional cultures." So here we have an initial tension, perhaps even a paradox from the outset for the anthropologist. On the one hand, the anthropologist is to try to see the world objectively without reference to his cognitive preconditions, whatever he's learned from his society, and the same thing with respect to value preconditions. On the other hand, that seems to be impossible. We always are going to approach the study of another culture from the perspective of our own culture. So how do we square this apparent circle from the beginning? And that's going to be a problem. Reference here to her colleague at Columbia, John Dewey, the philosopher. We have episodes on John Dewey in Philosophers Explained, so a sideways connection there is worth checking out. Now, in this vein, a stronger statement of the cognitive problem and the reason why objectivity may very well be impossible, or at least strongly attenuated. The life history of the individual is first and foremost an accommodation to the patterns and standards traditionally handed down in his community. So stopping there, the claim here is that first, we accommodate ourselves to our culture, to our community. It has its own standards, it has its own ways of doing things. We accommodate ourselves to that. Now, this is interesting. So it's not the case that we are born, say, with standards implanted by God, a conscience, and that maybe we will try to find ways to accommodate that with our community, or that we as individuals have the capacity to observe the world, to observe other human beings, to start working out our own standards and negotiate that with our community. Whatever those other things are, from Benedict's perspective, those are further down the list. First and foremost, it's accommodation to the community. Then even more strongly, from the moment of his birth, the customs into which he is born shape his experience and behavior. By the time he can talk, he is the little creature of his culture. And by the time he is grown and able to take part in its activities, its habits are his habits. Its beliefs, his beliefs. Its impossibilities are his impossibilities. So a strong statement here of a kind of social determinism, or a kind of cultural conditioning that is, if not total, the predominant factor in deciding who we are as individuals. What about cross-cultural possibilities? Every child that is born into his group will share them with him, and no child born into one on the opposite side of the globe can ever achieve the 1,000th part. So that then is to say that if you are born into a different culture, it's perhaps 1 in 1,000 elements of different cultures that you will be able to understand, accommodate, to appreciate in any significant sense. So not only is this posing then a problem for the anthropologist as social scientist to be able to understand a culture other than the one he or she is born into, if we are down the road then going to start talking about multiculturalism or cosmopolitanism, or how the mixing of various cultures is going to go right from the outset, this cultural conditioning is going to be a big challenge. Picking up the text again, in the first half of the 19th century, this elementary postulate of anthropology could not occur to the most enlightened person of Western civilization. This is interesting that she's dating this to the beginnings of the 1800s, which is to say the modern world, which perhaps began in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, the age of enlightenment. It would not be possible for anybody, she is claiming, to grasp this approach to anthropology, even in the age of enlightenment. And so what she's saying is that until the early part of the 1800s, perhaps human beings were dominated by their prejudices, their cultural prejudices. The way she puts it is here: man, all down his history, has defended his uniqueness like a point of honor. So we, prior to Copernicus, took it for granted that we are at the center of the universe and God has put us here for his special purposes, and so we are wonderfully special, and we take that perspective for granted. Next sentence, we mentioned Charles Darwin. Human beings among the animals are special and unique. We're not just one animal among many. So it takes a huge mental shift for ourselves to be able to see ourselves as just on a perhaps not particularly special planet far from the center of the action, as just one animal among many. And that then is going to be a precondition for when we start to study different human cultures, not automatically to take for granted that our culture is special, unique, the pinnacle of culture, the height of civilization, and so forth. Carrying on the quotation, primitive man never looked out over the world and saw mankind as a group and felt his common cause with his species. From the beginning, he was a provincial who raised the barrier high. His own group and all its ways of behaving was unique. We are special, and usually that comes, we are special and better, that bundling together. We are not likely to clear ourselves so easily of so fundamental a human trait. So here we are in the last, hair's breadth time of human development after centuries, millennia, tens of millennia, perhaps hundreds of thousands of thinking of ourselves a certain way. And now we're going to try to think objectively, universally, absolutely, etc. as social scientists. At the very minimum, we have our work cut out for us. But there is something distinctive about modernity, not only our gropings toward trying to be more objective. It is a social fact that after Columbus, of course, before Columbus, cultures were aware of other cultures and there was some limited interaction with them. But truly after Columbus, after 1492, we enter into an era of globalization where we are significantly aware of ourselves as part of a global culture with its hundreds and thousands of different cultures, and they are mixing with each other. And that is posing new challenges for us. Modern existence has thrown many civilizations into close contact. And at the moment, the overwhelming response to this situation is nationalism and racial snobbery. There has never been a time when civilization stood more in need of individuals who are genuinely culture conscious, who can see objectively the socially conditioned behavior of other peoples without fear and recrimination. So we need to have more tolerance, and that conjoined with more objectivity. But the challenge is going to be that flies in the face of the cultural traditions that we have all inherited for thousands and thousands of years. Can we even do so as a point of philosophical possibility? All right, with that opening, kind of a philosophical perspective on anthropology as a social science. In Chapter 2, Benedict turns to anthropology proper, and through several chapters shows what she and various other anthropologists have learned about other cultures across any number of core social institutions. So let's start with puberty. Puberty writes, the coming to adulthood, and a couple of very interesting sections that Benedict outlines in North America, focusing on the males and honor culture and its impact on boys becoming young men and then hopefully becoming full members, and then girls focusing on some going through puberty in some African cultures and what their practices are there. So let's start first with the boys. Adulthood in Central North America means warfare. Honor in it is the great goal of all men. So the cross-cultural practice, the tribes are primarily at war with each other, and that is the dominating fact about social life. And training for warfare there is the number one element of a young man's training. The great value, the top value in such cultures is honor. One strives for honor, and so we are in an honor culture. The constantly recurring theme of the youth's coming of age, as also of preparation for the warpath at any age, is a magic ritual for success in war. And so then we have ritualistic practices that the young men go through in order to acquire honor status as participants in a war culture. And then what do? They torture not one another, but themselves. They cut strips of skin from their arms and legs. They strike off their fingers. They drag heavy weights pinned to their chest or leg muscles. Their reward is enhanced prowess in deeds of warfare. So the idea then that we would torture each other, of course, that's a long-standing human practice. and then we want to say, well, maybe that's something that we can learn is barbaric and something that we should no longer do. Well, what about the practice of torturing oneself? Even more unimaginable to us now in the 20th century. And yet here we have a culture that goes out of its way to institute the practice of self-torture, and the self-torture makes sense in the context of a culture where you are going to war, where you are going to be mutilated, where you are going to suffer, where you are going to deal with pain. So showing that you are able to bear those things and even do them to yourselves, to oneself rather, is then a mark of showing that you are ready to be a man in such a culture. The value makes perfect sense in that culture, if not in other cultures. Now, let's consider the case of young girls going through puberty in Central Africa. Puberty rights may also be built upon the fact of girls' puberty and admit no extension to boys. Boys and girls are different, and so we have very different practices for girls becoming women. One of the most naive of these is the institution of the fatting house for girls in Central Africa. And so here we have standards for beauty, standards for attractiveness, standards for sexuality. Whom do I want to marry? Whom do I want to select as a child for my son? How do I, not possible for me, but how do I present myself as the most beautiful and desirable young woman so as to get the best possible marriage? In the region where feminine beauty is all but identified with obesity, the girl at puberty is segregated, sometimes for years, fed with sweet and fatty foods, allowed no activity, and her body rubbed assiduously with oils. So she's learning to become a beautiful woman in order, obviously, to attract the best young men. And this tribe's and cultural standards for beauty are then going to be seen as entirely alien to many other cultures, where being slim or even being skinny, or rather being very differently proportioned, are going to be prized. So the idea that there is a universal standard of feminine beauty, no, not really. All right, let's move on to some other issues. What about things we go, well, okay, we might then say are going to be great standards for how warlike and how tough and manly one needs to be, different standards for feminine beauty, right, and so forth. But maybe let's get to something more basic, life and death and killing. Can't we all agree, for example, that homicide and just killing other people is a bad thing? The diversity of cultures can be endlessly documented. It's a corollary of this that standards, no matter what aspect of behavior, range in different cultures from the positive to the negative pole. We might suppose that in the matter of taking life, all peoples would agree in condemnation. Nope. On the contrary, in a matter of homicide, it may be that one is blameless if diplomatic relations have been severed between neighboring countries. So different cultures, we're not talking to each other anymore, perfectly fine to kill people of the other culture. Or that one kills by custom his first two children. Yeah, just kill your first two kids, that's normal, ordinary from the perspective of this culture, whatever your other culture's strange standards are. Or that a husband has right of life and death over his wife. I kill my wife. What, you're objecting? Well, that's just our time-honored cultural tradition. Or that it is the duty of a child to kill his parents before they are too old. It may be that those are killed who steal a fowl, or who cut their upper teeth first, or who are born on a Wednesday, and so on and so forth. So Benedict's point is, even with respect to killing, the sacredness or the sacrosanctness or the foundational right that all individuals have, these are mythic constructions from the perspective of many cultures that have no problem killing other human beings as long as certain circumstances are in place. All right, how about then we move on to other cultures and other kinds of practices, coming back to issues of self-flagellation. We might look at various religious rites as they are practiced around the world. The Indians of North America outside the Pueblos engaging in certain fundamental Dionysian practices. It's interesting that Benedict here imports the Greek distinction between the Apollonian style and the Dionysian style, the Apollonian being more rational, more restrained, more dignified, more elevated, the Dionysian being more associated with irrationality, drunkenness, over emotionalism, seeking a kind of insanity where you are outside of your mind, or at least outside of your rational mind, in order to experience certain different but nonetheless significant kinds of cognitive states. The most conspicuous of these is probably their practice of obtaining supernatural power in a dream or vision. How do I communicate with the gods? How do I set myself just so that I can receive these all-important communications from the gods? On the Western plains, men sought out these visions with hideous tortures. They cut strips from the skin of their arms. They struck off fingers. They swung themselves from tall poles by straps inserted under the muscles of their soldiers. They went without food and water for extreme periods. Okay, so this is common set of practice. This is time-honored among certain tribes. And then maybe we come in and we start observing them and we say how horrific, how barbaric, how ridiculous, etc., etc. Now, of course, as objective social scientists, we're supposed to try not to do so, but we're struck by the alienness, nonetheless, and the barbarity of these practices. And then a little later, interestingly, Benedict points out, it's actually not that different from many traditional European practices, particularly in religious traditions, particularly in the more ascetic, self-flagellating Christian religious traditions, denying oneself food and water, flagellating the body, and so forth. And some of those have been carried over to North America, and the old style religion carried on in the New World. So she makes the point here, the penitentes of New Mexico are the last surviving sect in a far corner of the world of the flagellants of medieval Spain, a good Catholic Spain. And they have retained to the present day the Good Friday observances of identification with the crucified Savior. Behind him are his brethren with bared backs who lash themselves at every slow step with their great whips of bayonet cactus to which are fastened barbs of the cola. All right, so in this case here, we might then say by the time we are 20th century North Americans or 20th century Europeans, we forget that we came out of a cultural tradition that is engaging in similar practices. So there is a pattern here, but at the same time we do have a cognitive problem because we cannot easily understand these cultures that are so different from our own current practices, ones that are existing, but even ones that are in history. We can't wrap our minds around them as easily. All right, let's turn to sexual relationships and marriage relationships. She gives the example of the Dobu tribe here. Faithfulness is not expected between husband and wife. So many cultures, of course, will have a man and woman come together, they get married. The expectation is that they are going to be devoted to each other, that they have exclusivity with respect to sexual relations, and that adultery is a great sin to be protected by the culture's institutions. But here we have one where, of course, they have marriage rights and the man and woman come together, but they're not expected to remain faithful in any sense to each other. No Dobuan will admit that a man and woman are ever together, even for the shortest interval, except for sexual purposes. So the idea of the marriage here is the man and the woman, by and large, go about their lives, what they do as men. There's men do men stuff, women do women stuff, and they don't have intimacy beyond getting together for sexual purposes, and of course children are going to come from that. But then that means that there is the expectation there's going to be a lot of sexual cheating that goes on. And to one extent, we'll just expect it and turn a blind eye to it. But at the same time, she notes that among the Dobu, and that this also becomes a subject of gossip, a subject of fascination, a subject of the rumor mill, and it's almost like a form of theater, how all of the unfaithfulness that is going on, that everyone's by and large engaging in and expecting, is nonetheless treated as a public scandal. Adultery within this group is a favorite pastime. It is celebrated constantly in mythology, and its occurrence in every village is known to everyone from early childhood. It is a matter of profoundest concern to the outraged spouse. He, it is as likely to be she, bribes the children for information. Right? Who's my wife sleeping with? Who's my husband cheating on me with? I need to know. If it is the husband, he breaks the wife's cooking pots. So he finds out, and to show his rage, right? He damages some of her property, and of course that just feeds the rumor mill, and everybody has a great time chuckling about it. If it is the wife, she maltreats her husband's dog. He quarrels with her violently, and no quarrel can go unheard in the close-set leaf-thatched houses of the Dobu. So, adultery, almost like a soap opera practice in this culture, and to be expected and tolerated, and even at least in the soap opera kind of world, celebrated and enjoyed. Completely different from, of course, the way adultery treated in other cultures. How about cannibalism? If there's something that's more taboo and expected to be universal, how we treat the dead, treat them with honor, treat them with dignity, burial rites, and so forth. We know there's a lot of variety there, but the idea that we would eat dead people, for many people around the world, it's an almost physiological reaction that one has when one considers the possibility, not to mention all of the psychological things and the moral condemnations that seem to come naturally or religiously to us. But again, Benedict points out, not so. Let's see how cannibalism actually fares around the world. In some cases, cannibalism is ritualized. It's part of the major feasts, the major celebrations. And there are individuals who specialize in cannibal rites, including the cannibal dancer among the Kwakiutl. The initiation of the cannibal dancer was peculiarly calculated to express the Dionysian purport of Northwest Coast culture. Among the Kwakiutl, the cannibal society outranked all the others. So those who engage in cannibalism under ritual circumstances, who train for it, who practice, those are the highest people in that culture during the rituals at the winter dances, and all others must hold back from the feast till the cannibals had begun to eat. And so the cannibal dancers, they engage in their rituals, and when they have worked themselves up to a certain state, then, as Benedict describes it here, he fell upon the onlookers with his teeth and bit a mouthful of flesh from their arms. His dance was that of a frenzied addict, enamored of the food that was held before him, a prepared corpse carried on the outstretched arms of a woman. On great occasions, the cannibal ate the bodies of slaves who had been killed for that purpose. So, setting aside the issue of slavery, of course, practices with respect to slavery hugely variable right across the world, but here we have slaves who are ritually killed in order to be eaten by the cannibal dancers at the various feasts. And this is just one kind of cannibalism. The cannibalism of the Kwakiutl was at the farthest removed from the Epicurean cannibalism of many tribes of Oceania. So there are others where it's not so much engaging in dancing and rituals for the coming of winter and so forth, but rather just cannibalism and eating various body parts prepared in various ways with various seasonings and so on, as delicacies or even as the main courses practices, and one cultivates, right, one's cannibal Epicurean standards. Or the customary reliance upon human flesh in the diet of many tribes in Africa. There is not anything special. It's just what we eat. We eat these animals, we eat these humans, what's available, and it's not necessarily ritualized. It's just a normal practice. So we have adultery, we have homicide, we have self-mutilation, we have various puberty rites, and so on. Let's turn on to some more practices from around the world. What about homosexuality? Western civilization, this is now Western civilization in the early part of the 20th century. Western civilization tends to regard even a mild homosexual as an abnormal. The clinical picture of homosexuality stresses the neuroses and psychoses which give rise, and it emphasizes almost equally the inadequate functioning of the invert and his behavior. So we have various kinds of what we think are objective clinical treatments of the homosexuals, as well as all kinds of normative standards that denigrate them and justify treating them in certain ways. And then Benedict goes on to give some historical examples. The most famous being the ancient Greeks, and this is, of course, is pretty well known in Western culture, but in some societies they have even been especially acclaimed. Plato's Republic is, of course, the most convincing statement of the honorable estate of homosexuality. So homosexuality within certain confines is not merely to be tolerated, but to be approved of and sought out. It is presented as a major means to the good life. And Plato's high ethical evaluation of this response was upheld in the customary behavior of Greece at that period. So homosexuality to be honored or homosexuality to be dismissed, we have huge extremes already even in Western culture. Now, the other cultures around the world, the American Indians do not make Plato's high moral claims for homosexuality, but homosexualities are often regarded as exceptionally able. So that maybe they have different talents, different skills, and so if they have those different talents and different skills, and perhaps the view is that homosexuals are more likely to have those, then they have a functional honor in that particular culture. And then there is the perhaps different case, perhaps crossover case. In most of North America, there exists the institution of the berdache, as the French called them. These men-women were men who at puberty or thereafter took the dress and the occupations of women. Sometimes they married other men and lived with them. But sometimes they were married men with no inversion, that is to say, they're not sexually interested in other men, but rather they dress as women and take the role of women because they are persons of weak sexual endowment who chose this role to avoid the jeers of the women. Pausing there. So perhaps the point here is that here are men who are not particularly masculine, or they don't feel themselves to be particularly masculine. They don't think that they are going to strive or be able to achieve the level of masculine honor that a mighty hunter or a mighty warrior is going to be able to achieve. But they know that if they are maintaining the male rule, that it's going to be not only the other men that will look down at them, but the women who will come after them and berate them and tease them and insult them and worse for their lack of masculinity. So to avoid all of that, they will adopt the role of the women. And then contrasting these North American berdaches with some over in Eastern Asia, in Siberia. The berdaches, though, were never regarded as of first-rate supernatural power, as similar men-women were in Siberia. Now, when we turn to North America, one of the interesting things about Benedict's book is that she's very wide-ranging in reporting on anthropological studies from all over the world, all of these different practices about cannibalism and homosexuality and homicide and so forth. And all through she is maintaining what she has urged from the beginning, that one should take a dispassionate or disinterested, striving for objective evaluation and a kind of tolerance with respect to whatever practices one encounters around the world, even if they strike one as alien or barbaric from one's own cultured perspective, but setting aside that as only one's own cultured perspective. One interesting thing is that toward the end of the book, Benedict turns to contemporary North American culture, particularly the culture of the United States. And here she describes a taxonomy of various American types, but the issue of tolerance and objectivity seems to get set aside or starts to become even more of a challenge for Benedict. The interesting thing is that one would expect from her strong emphasis on the kind of cultural conditioning that she would enjoy being an American, and that her problem would be to set aside her American preconceptions in order to understand other cultures. But it seems to be that the opposite comes out. When she starts to treat of America, there is a moralistic, but a negative moralistic tone that enters into her description. So let's illustrate that. So here's the American tendency at the present time, which leans so far to the opposite extreme that it is not easy for us to picture the changes that such an attitude would bring about. So how can we achieve any measure of tolerance and scientific objectivity and cross-cultural acceptance and so forth? And here she offers a threefold taxonomy of types of Americans. The most predominant one, the one that she mentions first, is what she describes somewhat metaphorically as Middletown. So this is the average, ordinary American living in a small town, who knows where in the Middle West or whatever. Middletown is a typical example of our usual urban fear of seeming in however slight an act different from our neighbors. So we're all conformists, or the vast majority of Americans are conformists. We don't want to do anything different from what our neighbors are doing. We're going to dress the same, drive the same kind of cars, watch the same kind of shows, same kind of foods and habits, and so forth. Eccentricity is more feared than parasitism. So standing out is a great fear. So we have this very conformist kind of culture apparently in America. What that then means is that Americans, from her perspective, are going to have an even greater difficulty understanding, let alone tolerating, cultural practices outside of Middletown that are very different from other parts of the world. They're instinctively going to be conformist, prejudicial, and intolerant with respect to that, and that's going to be a problem. We notice this in the kids. Children in school make their great tragedies out of not wearing a certain kind of stockings, not joining a certain dancing class, not driving a certain car. The fear of being different is the dominating motivation recorded in Middletown. But what we in the modern world need more than anything is people who are tolerant, more open to being cosmopolitan and multicultural and so on. So Americans then from Benedict's perspective are going to be especially problematic. They're more likely to demand conformity and to want everyone to do things their way. And that for her is going to be a problem. Notice a little bit later that we start in a description of other kinds of Americans to use more normatively charged language, the language of psychopaths. You describe practices in other cultures as sociopathic or psychopathic, but the labels do apply when we're talking about some people in American society for Benedict. Not all psychopaths, of course, are individuals whose native responses are at variance with those of their civilization. Another large group of psychopaths are those who are merely inadequate and who are strongly enough motivated for their failure to be more than they can bear. So we have people who are in America, but they feel themselves to be failures by American standards. And the claim here is that America breeds a whole lot more of them. Why does it breed? Because it has a go, 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 winner takes all, strive to the top and conquer the world mentality. Also, in a society in which the will to power is most highly rewarded, a sideways reference to Friedrich Nietzsche, the will to power phrase. The claim here is that then the American culture is a Nietzschean or a quasi-Nietzschean will to power domination kind of culture. Now, in such a culture, if that's the predominant ethos, those who fail may not be those who are differently constituted, but simply those who are insufficiently endowed. So what about all of those people who just don't have what it takes to succeed in a culture where it is will to power, will to power, will to power? The inferiority complex takes a great toll of suffering in our society. So we then have two groups that have been singled out as predominant or as significant: the conformists of Middletown and the large number of people who are self-feeling failures dominated by an inferiority complex. And we know inferiority complexes then are also going to lead to various other kinds of social pathologies as well. Now, we've been considering individuals from the point of view of their ability to function adequately in their society. This adequate functioning is one of the ways in which normality is clinically defined. So, being able to function according to the pre-existing norms of one's society, that is how one defines normality. Normality then is culturally relative and internal to a culture. And it's not going to be something that's externally applied to other cultures. You can't take one culture's internally defined norms and apply them in an external way to other cultures. And so this has to be then an internal description, failure to perform according to the standards of American culture. But are those standards of American culture good standards, ones that should be celebrated and so forth? And we have some indications that Benedict is opposed to that idea. Now, we then, in the subsequent paragraphs, have some mention of the Puritans. And notice here, again, we have the phrase psychopathic. Let me highlight it. And then we have, again, at the bottom of this paragraph, the phrase mental diseases. And so we have a kind of inheritance of psychopathy from the beginnings of American culture, however much we've gotten past the Puritan culture. But let's read a little bit. The Puritan divines of New England in the 18th century were the last persons whom contemporary opinion in the colonies regarded as psychopathic. Now, this is interesting. Why would we apply the label psychopathic here and not just say, well, that was a different culture at a different time, and we have to say, well, what are their standards internally, the Puritan way of looking at things, and just describe them according to their own terms. But we are, in this case, applying a contemporary standard and a contemporary label to the Puritans from 2 or 3 centuries ago. Yet to a modern observer, it is they, not the confused and tormented women they put to death as witches, who were the psychoneurotics of Puritan New England. And again, a kind of mental disease is apparently operative here. And now we come into contemporary times. We have had the Middletown conformists. We have the people plagued by their inferiority complexes and those who feel a failure in life. Now we have one other important group here. And notice again the language in which Benedict describes these Americans. In our own generation, extreme forms of ego gratification are culturally supported in a similar fashion. Arrogant and unbridled egoists as family men, as officers of the law and in business, have been again and again portrayed by novelists and dramatists, and they are familiar in every community. Like the behavior of Puritan divines, their course of action are more asocial than those of the inmates of penitentiaries. So, criminals whom we lock up, nonetheless, American culture celebrates as family men, as titans of business, all of these people who are, in fact, worse than, more asocial than the people who are apparently locked up. In some way, they get away with it. We allow them to exist. They are not described in our manuals of psychiatry because they are supported by every tenet of our civilization. They are, as she just says a little bit later, a type of abnormality. Now, the interesting question here then for Benedict as philosopher, generalizing from the anthropology, is on the one hand the claim that we would expect people born in a certain culture to adopt a certain culture as norms and just to apply them and take them as normal. But Benedict herself here, interestingly, seems to be highly critical and negative with respect to the norms of her own society. And then the claim then that of proper striving for objectivity as a social scientist, that one should dispassionately and in a value neutral way describe whatever culture it is one is attending to. But in the case of American culture, Benedict is using all sorts of strongly normative claims in the course of describing contemporary American society. Nonetheless, she does draw a moral of the story, a moral of how anthropology is an important, perhaps the most important type of science in the modern world, given the collision of cultures from all over the world and what we should be striving for. Social thinking at the present time has no more important task before it than that of taking adequate account of cultural relativity. First, we have to become aware of the many cultures out there, that they have very different ways of doing things, and that relativity of practices and norms is a bottom line reality about our world. That then poses a challenge for the way we've traditionally thought about morals, ethics, and normative standards in general. Anthropology, from Benedict's perspective, shows it has pointed out its incongruity with the orthodox dreams of permanence and ideality, and with the individual's illusions of autonomy. Let's break those down into the three parts. There are no permanent standards. There are no moral ideals, those two. And the individual is not an agent that has agency, autonomy, power. We are creatures of our society. We think, we act, we value only by the standards of our society, which have been conditioned into us from birth. If, however, we can become aware of these things, right? That there is great cultural relativity across the world, that there are no ideal objective moral standards, there are no permanent moral standards, that individuals are but creatures of their society, then we have a positive social possibility. We shall then arrive at a more realistic social faith, accepting as grounds of hope and as new basis for tolerance the coexistence and equally valid patterns of life which mankind has created for itself. So what we need to do is to say that all patterns of life, all of the different cultures' ways of doing things are equally valid. There is no one that is better than any other, and there is no way for us to step outside of our culturally inculcated standards and evaluate them relative to others. And even if we couldn't find some independent of culture standard by which to measure all of the different cultures. We have to accept that all of them are equally valid. And that then means it's not simply a culturally cognitive practice we need to engage in. We need to tolerate, accept the varied patterns that are out there, never to condemn and possibly not even to valorize ways of doing things outside of our own. Now, there are, of course, some remaining intellectual and social puzzles here. If it's the case that we are all bound by our own culture's norms, how can we possibly tolerate another culture's norms? It seems to go against the conditioning claim. And what are we going to do, though, with cultures for whom tolerance is not a value? Built into their culture is intolerance, and they prize intolerance. So if we are going to be tolerant and they're going to be intolerant, how are we going to tolerate the intolerant without setting ourselves up for self-destruction? So there are some continuing puzzles here coming out of Benedict's anthropologically based cultural relativism. Of course, she is aware of them, and that's the ongoing philosophical challenge.